Thanks, Ray. Ray's got a second-time job selling Cleveland, as all of you can tell. I'm batting cleanup here, as you can tell from all of the speakers, so I'm going to just try to tie things together. We're going to kind of skip through this presentation. And as you listen to Luke's presentation or Donna's presentation, they talked about iteration, and they talked about clouds, and they talked about a process that seemed long, and it is long. It's sort of 5 years from that moment of aha when you're in the surgical theater to the point at which you might actually have a patent, let alone something that is useful to form a company or license off to another corporation. And I want to go back to what Ray started with, which is what's motivating you through all of this. Because after 5 years of going through the iteration, after 5 years of going through that cloud, by now you've lost your visions of richness and visions of receiving great honors from your peers and all of that. What's motivating you is your knowledge that what you have discovered and what you have developed is actually going to improve patient care. And if you've got that motivation, that's what's going to drive you to the next phase, which is equally complicated, and that's forming companies. Now, Dennis and Ray both talked a little bit about their own experiences of launching companies and how they have had to cobble together resources and individuals to take what they had as initially ideas and aha moments into products, in Ray's case, that are already being sold, and in Dennis's case, which are now finally getting to the point where they're getting to a pre-commercial prototype. I'm going to talk a little bit about how one does that in the event that you're actually going to create a company. Donna talked a lot about the licensing process. If you're going to license this off to a J&J or a BARD or a Covidien, that's a different process that you deal with your technology transfer offices if you're employed by an academic center. But in the event that you want to form a company, you work through tech transfer, but then you also have to then, as both Dennis and Ray have demonstrated, work with a company in raising the resources that are required to convert your aha into a product that's actually being used by patients and by physicians. Nothing to disclose. We'll just skip. We'll do a quick commercial on BioEnterprise. As Ray mentioned, we're in Cleveland. Our focus is we are a nonprofit organization. We're neither technology transfer nor are we venture capital. We actually are a matchmaker between companies that emerge out of our research institutions, including university hospitals where Ray is on staff, and the funding community. And our focus is on making our geography a nationally recognized center for healthcare innovation. Just the last part of the commercial, we've worked with over 90 companies in the last 8 years. Those 90 companies have raised about $900 million in capital in that period to commercialize their technologies. Over half of those companies are medical device firms, including Ray's Synapse Biomedical. And as you see on the last set of bullet points, it's from a mix of sources. I think each of the speakers has spoken to the notion that it's not just one source of capital. There's a lore that's out there, at least among most clinician innovators, that once you have that aha, the next thing you do is you go and you find the venture capitalist, and then all of a sudden everything happens. And what you've heard through the stories, which are actually very typical, not atypical stories, is it's a mix of resources that you need to tap into. There's funding sources that are available from the federal government, from disease-specific foundations, from state governments, from large companies, from venture capitalists, as well as your friends, families, and any other neighborhood fools that might invest with you. Dennis had mentioned what's going on in the venture world. Given what's happening in the economic landscape globally, traditional venture capital has moved further and further away from that point of aha in terms of what they're willing to invest in. They're not interested in just intellectual property. They want companies that have already got prototypes and oftentimes have already shown effectiveness in clinical populations and are really ready for the point of launching into sales. That means they're through the process that Luke described through, or largely through it. They're through the process of reimbursement, and they're really ready to ramp up. We've talked about the stages of capital, from seed all the way across to exit, and you can see how these things pair together. I want to just talk a little bit about, let me go back here, what this means for companies. So if the venture market is not, if the model that you have in your head is you have an invention and all of a sudden venture capitalists are going to jump in with piles of money to take that invention from your concept all the way to the marketplace, if that's not what's going on out there, and it really never was exactly like that, what's the alternate source? And it is tapping all sources of capital, equity, debt, and grant, and a broad network of funders around your concept. And it's around positioning your company by understanding what each of those separate funders desire. Now, the most important thing, I think, as you set up a company, you've gotten through that proof of concept period where you have demonstrated that your device actually has clinical effectiveness. There's sort of two things that you need to understand in terms of what you need to be prepared to have in place as you go out for the next phase of developing a company. Whether this is going after grant funding or venture funding, these are the two things. The first is you really need to know your competition. And your competition is not, in Ray's case, someone else working on a diaphragmatic pacing system. That's not the competition that you need to know. The competition is what is the standard of care today for a patient in that condition? Is it a drug therapy? Is it mechanical ventilation? Is it nothing at all? What is that competition? What does it cost for the patient? What does it cost to the physician that's implementing that standard? What does it cost to the insurance system? You have to understand how your technology, how your innovation fits into the full competitive landscape. And that's both the standard of care, and then the second piece of that is you need to know the intellectual property landscape, because that's going to give you a window into what's coming up that's also addressing that same patient condition that you are interested in. The single greatest failure point we see as we evaluate startup companies is they don't have a great sense of what their competition is. And if you don't know what your competition is, you don't really know what your value proposition is in the way that a business person is going to understand it, in the way that your market is going to want you to be able to articulate it. So you need to understand your competition, which will allow you then to articulate a case both to the FDA in terms of why your product is going to be clinically effective and safe, as well as to reimbursement agencies. And that's both Medicare and Medicaid, but also the private payers. You need to have more than FDA certification to be of any value in the commercial marketplace. You need to have payers that are interested in actually supporting the treatment that you're putting out onto the marketplace. And what they're going to look at is that competitive landscape and how does your device not only improve patient care, but how is it going to reduce healthcare costs, and how is it going to ensure that this thing actually gets adopted. And the second most important thing then, once you understand your competition, is finding the management team. And this is more than the engineer that's going to help you develop the prototype. That's the starting point. You need to go from invention and concept and vision on a napkin to something that you can actually demonstrate in a clinical setting. Then you need to really identify who is the right management person and team that's going to lead that from that point of proof of concept all the way to the marketplace. The reason the management team is critical is they're the ones who are going to be responsible while you are still working at your clinical practice. They're the ones who are going to be responsible for building your idea into a company. And that can involve a whole host of different activities. It's more than just your invention. Oftentimes, management teams that build companies are going to look at your invention and say, this is an interesting starting point for a company, but the technology in and of itself is insufficient. We're going to have to license in additional technologies. And they're going to go to people like Donna at Columbia or other technology transfer offices, and they're going to pull in additional intellectual property so you have an offering that is complete for the marketplace. They're also going to look at your company and say, this is what we know how to do. What else do we need to partner with so we're actually able to take a product all the way to the market? That's everyone from your contract manufacturers who are developing your device to the distribution point on how that device is actually going to get in the hands of all of your peers in this room. So choosing a management team that is actually experienced in your space is absolutely critical. And after you've got the management team and you understand your competition, then it's obviously a situation of having to raise the cash that's required to take it from wherever you are in proof of concept all the way to the point where it's generating sufficient revenue that it's a profitable company, or it's generating sufficient clinical interest that you all of a sudden have offers from the Johnson & Johnsons of the world to acquire your startup company. As you think about funders, again, not to, let's see, there you go. Both Dennis and Ray talked a little bit about their own experiences of how they developed their companies from a myriad of different sources. These are 3 examples from our portfolio. They're not including Ray's company. But you can just see that there's a mix of funders, and they don't necessarily go sequentially. So it's not, while my process chart lays it up as starts with grants, goes all the way through venture capital, these things are also iterative. You tap into funding whenever it's available. The important part of understanding the funding world, and this is where your management team is essential, is that everyone's motivation in funding you is different. Venture capitalists want to think about what's their liquidity. They've been given money by their investors to invest in companies like yours, but to get the money back out. They don't want you to run a 20-year company. They're not interested in that. They want to figure out how they are going to sell your company in 5 to 7 years so they get their money back and they can give their money back to their investors. If you think about strategic investors, their motivations are obviously to broaden their own product portfolio. They're looking at your company from a completely different vantage point than a venture investor would. Your angel funds, your friends and family have different motivations for why they might want to get involved. In Ray's case, one of his angel investors was one of his first patients. So his motivation was not so much about financial return as it's a therapy that he thought would be useful for not just himself, but a broader patient population. When you talk about the grant sources, Dennis brought this up when he talked about the New York State grant. The motivation for the New York State program is local jobs, local economic development. The motivation for federal grant sources tends to be scientific development. The motivation for the defense agencies are military use of technologies. You have to understand your audience when you're going out to raise money, and if you have a seasoned management team that is savvy, they understand that the presentation that they're going to use to pitch a venture capital audience is not the same that they're going to take into a disease-specific foundation because the motivations are completely different. And if you don't align your pitch to what the audience is interested in funding, there's no chance for you to be successful in securing those resources to advance your company. Let's see. So, just in summary here to close up and leave at least a few minutes here for questions across all the speakers, this is when you get to the proof of concept and you start building the team that's going to take your device all the way to the marketplace, fundraising is your CEO's #1 constant priority. So as an inventor or an innovator that's checking in on the development of a company, many of you will have a tendency to be interested in learning more about how is that device doing. What's the second prototype look like? How are we doing on the engineering? What are the clinical studies showing? What's going on as we take these products out to the marketplace? Those are all great questions to be asking, but the other question that you need to constantly be asking your management team is, where are we on funding? And even if we just closed $3 million from a grant source or $3 million from a venture capital firm, the CEO's #1 job is making sure that a company has the resources the company needs to be able to take that product and achieve the vision for that company. You never stop fundraising. And so your questions to your CEOs ought to be, who are we tapping into next? How are we staying in touch with funders? Who are we lining up so that we're not hitting that cliff where all of a sudden you think that you've made a lot of progress in your product all the way to the marketplace, but you find that you've run out of cash and you can no longer continue the venture. With that, I'll stop my comments and leave at least a few minutes for questions broadly from the audience on probably any of the speakers. Yeah. Sure. So this is where, depending on what geography you're coming from or what setting you're coming from, your technology transfer office can be a great partner in that, or an organization like a bioenterprise, a venture development group. There's a couple different ways to determine that. If you're in the clinical world today, you've got a sense, obviously, of what the standard of care is and what the diverse set of practices might be around a patient condition. The harder thing to find out is what's going on that might not yet be in the public domain, that's being developed, either within universities or within large companies. And that you can do two things. One is the intellectual property search itself. When you are filing for a patent, usually you are pulling information about what has already been patented around the world, so you understand what's already made it to that point. The second place that we look is what's going on in settings like this. You'll see in the audience at this conference, there's a number of corporate development types. They're paying attention to poster sessions. They're paying attention to what's going on in the emerging technologies presentations, because these things are percolating well before they ever get to the point of being discussed in clinical settings of any type. So that's where you have to scour for that full set of information.